Thank you. And I'm actually going to talk about the bit between individuals and the state. But there is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. This is one of the most iconic misquotes of my generation. It's also one of the most ironic as well, as Mrs. Thatcher went on to make changes in society which more or less precipitated its demise as a concept and accelerated the prominence of a concept of the individual. The Conservatives are now claiming that there is something called the society, but it's just not the same thing as the state. However, the very confused discussions about big society indicate that we might not necessarily know what it is anymore. Within a lot of campaigning circles and within the government at the moment, there's a wide range of attempts to achieve individual behaviour change. These are particularly epitomised by the nudge agenda. Within a whole range of areas, particularly public health and climate change, we have a government which is telling us that it's all our responsibility and that we're to blame for all the problems. We have a health minister who more or less says, of course it's people's fault they're fat. But what is the actual scope for significant individual behaviour change to bring about significant action? If we take the issue of climate change, in a worst-case scenario, you might consider that we might face 6 degrees warming. With 6 billion people on the planet, you can do the maths, and any individual might actually be only able to bring about 1/1000th of a degree change. So there has to be something more apart from a set of individuals, something which is about how we all behave together, and also about the environment we sit within. In terms of a public health agenda, there's been a concept, the obesogenic environment, going about for a few years, one which says that there's environmental factors and social factors which lead people to be more likely to become fat than if they were in other situations. We might also want to consider the slightly unpleasant term, a carbogenic environment, a similar set of environmental and social factors that lead people to have high carbon footprints. But going back to the issue of us as individuals, because I'd like to argue that this is actually one of the problems in and of itself. The concept of an individual as we know it started to come to prominence in the 16th century. About this time, the world looked something like this. Western civilization had been sort of used to living in a crowded, filthy Europe and was breaking out into a new world which had effectively limitless resources. This allowed people to see themselves as individuals free to act however they wanted with very little limit on their behaviour. Now, in a world where we're pressing sort of 6+ and heading towards 9 billion people, the very concept of how we see ourselves as individual human beings, I would argue, is just completely irrelevant, and we have to refresh it. Now, as we've headed towards this increasingly liberalised, individual, atomised way of being, then we've also tended to lose a lot of the moral, ethical, existential bases for our society. We seem to be led now by an agenda which tends to reduce to nothing more by more for less, a question of more of what? Well, whatever we can get our hands on, and produced by less and less an economic efficiency argument that increasingly produces really inhuman answers that are unsympathetic to people's conditions. And when do we want more? Well, preferably as soon as possible. We've invented credit cards so we can actually get it all before we can actually afford to pay for it, taking the waiting out of wanting. And whilst we've become obsessed with this more for less agenda, we've tended to forget about some of the sort of bigger questions like enough or why. And if we just look at some of the things that we would take to be the core things that a civilized society provides for people, like food, clothes, and shelter, we currently have a food system where food is traded as a commodity in order to make profits for hedge funds. We also grow foodstuffs to turn into fuels to put into gas-guzzling motor vehicles. If we look at clothes, we're quite happy to buy lots of our clothes that travel halfway around the world from sweatshops often made by children. And in terms of shelter, what used to be a concept of a home and a roof over our head has become an issue of investment and property speculation. But this desire for more is just not something that is just an inherent need in human nature. It's avidly fueled by factors in our culture and society. The media play a very large part in this, encouraging people to have the aspiration to lavish lifestyles of celebrities. Apparently now 22% of young women aspire to sleep with footballers just to become famous. The aspiration to wealth is an aspiration effectively to damage the planet. It's nurtured and it's carefully manipulated. George Orwell once said, advertising is the rattling of a stick in the swill bucket. The focus on the individual, though, not only fails to acknowledge this huge tsunami of external factors that constantly threatens to swamp the little fishing boats of our individual attention, but it also pretends that individuals are all equivalent. If we take a recent campaign to encourage people to change their climate behaviour, the 10-10 campaign, it encouraged people to all reduce their carbon footprint by 10%. This was launched with celebrity endorsements like this, where one famous author suggested that in order to sort out his carbon footprint, he'd take one less flight out of every 10. At the same time as he's choosing to sort of shuffle around his travel plans, the same message going to a little old lady who might be unable to adequately heat her house at the moment might encourage her to turn the heat down even further, threatening her health. Yes, we do all have an important role to play in terms of the climate, as far as the climate's concerned, but it's very different. Some people are up to their necks in it, others are just paddling. Relying on individual behaviour change is like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. There's 60 million people in this country, and addressing everyone individually is not necessarily an efficient way to go. So how do we break out of this view of looking at ourselves like individuals? Some work by Wilkinson and Pickett in their fantastic book, The Spirit Level, started to move towards this by looking at different ways we can view and compare societies. In this one, we have high life expectancy on the left-hand side, and it indicates that it can be achieved without having very high carbon dioxide emissions. And so our challenge is effectively to move the UK from the middle of there over to the left-hand side. But whilst doing that, we might also want to consider what we have on the vertical axis. Is life expectancy, longevity, the desire for more life simply what we want, or should we start looking at what we actually want from life and focus on quality of life? And so just to finish, I'd argue that sort of from public health to climate change, there's a whole range of things we desperately want and need to change within society. But focusing on the individual is a very inefficient way to do things. And often it really fails to account for the huge societal influences on and pressures on people. But the window in which we have to choose how we change the direction of our society is a very small one. As we head towards 2050, the balance of population and the balance of economics in the world is changing very, very rapidly. As our population becomes a smaller and smaller fraction of the global population, and our legacy and power that was inherited from empire fade, then we're going to be less and less able to have the choice about how we decide our futures. If we don't move the whole of our society on a path to sharing the planet nicely with people, then fairly soon we're going to have the leftovers from when everyone else gets there wants more than their fair share. So whilst all this change might start with the individual, I would argue that we always have to bear in mind that we have to go much further, much broader, and much deeper than this. Thank you.